Data visualization is an ethical act. I say this not to be bold, as usually data graphics or visualizations are used in support of textual or verbal argumentation. I argue that visualization deserves a more central role. Data visualization is an ethical act because it facilitates meaningful interactions with the world, has real human consequences, and will lead to informed decisions. Consider this graph. This shows two quantities. On the horizontal axis is the year since 1950, and the vertical axis the average global temperature in degrees Celsius. This graph confirms our intuitive sense about climate change. Our Earth is getting warmer. Models from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change illustrate the variety of ways this warming could continue under different warming scenarios. Yet in spite of this realization and the overwhelming scientific consensus, there still exists a cognitive dissonance exemplified in a recent quotation by the White House press secretary in response to the National Climate Assessment. Data visualization is an ethical act because when done correctly, it facilitates meaningful interactions with the world beyond what we can sense. To contrast the graphics I just showed you, consider this graphic of the same data, which is called a climate spiral. This graphic is oriented like a clock, appealing to our cyclical nature of seasonality and time. The radius of the circle represents the temperature. As this graphic starts, you will see a slow progression of global temperature over time. We can meaningfully compare across years due to its cyclical orientation. You notice that over time, the radius of the spiral continues to increase, borrowing ideas from mathematics of a system in disequilibrium. This next graphic also has a similar setup, but now includes future model projections from the business as usual scenario, meaning no reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Notice the magnitude of the warming by the end of the century. I argue that this visualization is highly effective and appeals to our sense of understanding on several levels. This is an elegant and sophisticated visualization that demands our attention. Data visualization is an ethical act because it can have real human consequences. I offer two examples of this, a historical and a modern day example. The first example is about John Snow, and that he did know something. Not that John Snow, but rather the English physician. Cholera was, and is still a fatal disease today. Yet in the 19th century, little was known about how it was transmitted. Many people thought it was from bad air. In 1854, the Soho neighborhood in London was suffering from a cholera epidemic. John Snow decided to trace the deaths of cholera and the outbreak spatially through a simple mark at the home of each one of the deaths. This map, shown here, illustrates the association between the location and cholera death, signaling that in this case, the source of the outbreak was the water pump on Broad Street at the center of this map. The legacy of this ethical act lives on today. This next graphic is a modern day rendering using tools known to us right now and is commonly reproduced as a canonical example for geospatial data mapping. Many people point to this visualization as the birth of the field of epidemiology, not to mention the huge study of geographic information systems and spatial statistics. The creation of this visualization was an ethical act because it contributed to the saving of many lives both immediately and in the future. Here is another example where data visualization, or the effective absence thereof, played a tragic role. I was in kindergarten watching the launch of the Challenger space shuttle, which tragically killed all passengers on board shortly after launch. This case has been analyzed extensively as an example of the challenges of leadership and decision making. I want to focus on the human impact of this tragedy on a key player, an engineer at the rocket manufacturer Morton Thylacol. About 2.5 years ago, NPR did an interview of one of the Morton Thylacol engineers. It is a worthwhile listen, and I would encourage you to listen to the full interview. But let me play you two brief clips from the interview.
Ebling and 4 colleagues had tried to stop the Challenger launch. They presented data to Morton Thiokol engineers and NASA officials and argued that it would be too cold to launch. The rubber seals on the shuttle's booster rockets wouldn't seal. The engineers were overruled, and that night, tearful and angry, he told his wife, Darlene,
"It's going to blow up." And I did my best to let the world know I was one of the few that really was close to the situation.
Let me show you what the rocket engineers faxed over to NASA right before the launch. This is a table that relates incidents of O-ring failure and the temperature. This engineer lived with the pain the rest of his life. The second clip emphasizes the real human consequences to data visualization.
Sitting in a big easy chair in his living room, his eyes watery and his face grave, Ebling concludes he was inadequate. He just didn't argue the data well enough, he says. He's prayed about this for the last 30 years.
And I think that was one of the mistakes that God made. He shouldn't have picked me for that job. I don't know. But next time I talk to him, I'm going to ask him, why me? You picked a loser.
I get sad every time I hear this story. This next graphic that I want to show you is another one based upon the same data whose basic elements were generated by Edward Tufte. This graphic includes the data and the information that was faxed over to NASA, but on the left-hand side also highlights the predicted temperature at the time of launch. I can only imagine if the outcome would have been different had the second graphic been relayed. There is some light to this story. Some of you may notice one person seated here, Ronald McNair, namesake for the McNair Scholars Program we have here at Augsburg, which supports underrepresented undergraduate students in pursuing their dreams of graduate study. I think of no better way to honor the sacrifice of the Challenger and its crew than treating data visualization as an ethical act. Finally, data visualization is an ethical act because it can help us, and I do mean the collective us, to make informed decisions. This other example comes from Williams College, where they're using the same graphic but mapping major to career. Visualizations such as these underscore why a liberal arts degree matters. There are a plurality of pathways in and through a career. It challenges us to reject the unary or even binary decisions that students have in order so that they can make a living and to make a life. As we think about being student ready and as we hold conversations with our students, both informally and through formal advising sessions, where we diligently link up the classes that students take, wouldn't visualizations such as these lead to a more nuanced conversation between major and career? Wouldn't visualizations like these help us understand the myriad of ways, small and large, for better or for worse, that everything is connected? Data visualization is an ethical act because it facilitates informed decisions. Thank you.